You're tuned into the Writing Community Chat Show, the live streaming YouTube podcast that brings you the stories of authors, screenwriters, and more. Indie or established, this show's for the community, and we invite you to be a part of it. Head to the writingcommunitychatshow.com for more info. The WCCS. Together as one, we get it done.
Hello and welcome to the Writing Community Chat Show. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Writing Community Chat Show. Again, as always, we are very excited to be sat back here chatting to you guys and to a brand new author to chat to on the show. And we've got a very exciting guest for you guys tonight, and I'm really looking forward to it. But first of all, let's do the catch up as normal in the chat. Let us know how you're doing. Chris, how are you doing? How's your week been?
Yeah, I'm good. I've been looking at different things and apparently hand gestures this week. That's why I was waving a bit more. I was listening to a podcast about a behavioural specialist and a psychologist in behaviour, and she was saying that there's things that we can do to make ourselves appear more warm and radiate more warmth, and one of them was the hand gesture.
Yeah.
Obviously, certain hand gestures probably won't do that, but apparently the showing of the palm was quite a good thing. It showed an openness and a willingness and a warmth, but not too much palm. You can be too warm as well. So yeah.
Well, I do notice with the dictators of the world, the leaders, should I say, are very much, they emphasize the whole body with hands and head movements when they put the point across.
She said as well that there's a power move with the hands, which was this.
Yes.
So maybe if we do this, we appear to be more powerful, but I'm not feeling it, to be honest.
I mean, look how powerful both those Chris's look right now. Yeah. I've got author news this week because last week we didn't have any. Not because there wasn't any, but there wasn't really any that I kind of felt is worth sharing in that sense. But this week's really is. It's kind of a groundbreaking thing because there's a lot of people in the social world that is fleeing from X. That's one of the reasons. And moving to things like Blue Sky. However, there's something happened in the last week in the writing community that is quite amazing. And that was just about 10 days ago or so. A woman called Vicky Ball. Have you heard about this, Chris?
No.
So Vicky Ball is an author on Twitter, like a lot of us. And, you know, we spent a lot of time on Twitter trying to make things work, trying to figure out the world of algorithms and failing drastically. However, this woman was going to book signings like, you know, people should do when they're trying to sell their books on the ground level. And she had a bit of a torrid time where she only sold 2 books and she retweeted it. So I'm going to show you the tweet. And she said, sold 2 books is a retweet of her book event. And it went viral. It had 24 million impressions, 746,000 likes, 31,000 retweets, and 2.2 thousand comments. And that is pretty incredible. So what happened as a result of this, she went from selling 2 books to becoming a bestseller. And she ended up on Sky News, ITV News, and many other things that gave her massive exposure and talking to her about her story as well. So magic can happen in the writing community. And on Twitter or X, things still do kind of go viral. Why that happened, I couldn't tell you.
No. I mean, I honestly, at one point, I thought you were going to say she sold 3 books. Because my experience of selling books is very difficult. But yeah, no, I like it. The fact that we live in a world where that can exist, is great.
Yeah, of course.
Make it happen more often is what I say.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing, though? Well, the best of luck to her. I hope that continues with her career and that does boost her in terms of her career, too. So I want to get tonight's guest on sooner rather than later, Chris, because there's so much we can talk about. And you just put a brilliant comment in the chat. She didn't even have to hook to. Yes, that is brilliant. That's even more reason why that should go viral. Yeah, I'm gonna get tonight's guest on. I'm gonna jump into some conversation because it's going to be a brilliant chat and there's lots to talk about. So Tonight, we have the privilege of speaking with a literary powerhouse whose name has become synonymous with thrilling, edge-of-your-seat storytelling. Our guest is none other than J.D. Barker, a New York Times and internationally best-selling author, celebrated for his masterful ability to weave suspense, horror, and mystery into unforgettable tales. With books like Forsaken, Dracul, and The Fourth Monkey, J.D. has captivated the imaginations of readers worldwide, earning thousands of glowing reviews and legions of devoted fans. But JD's journey is just as captivating as his books. From his early days as a journalist and ghostwriter to collaborating with the family of Bram Stoker and even co-authoring with James Patterson, he has built a career filled with groundbreaking achievements and invaluable lessons for writers. So tonight we're going to dive deep into his remarkable career, explore his next release, We Don't Talk About Emma, Above Chris's Head, and get some real-world writing tips from our community chat time. So remember your questions, guys. Please join me in giving a nice warm welcome to the amazing JD Barker. Hello, JD.
Good. Hey, I'm working on. Was this it?
Yes, it was.
I'm autistic, so like hand gestures, like I always come off weird when I do a hand gesture. I can't do it right, and it's funny because as the book starts selling in more and more places, I go to all these different countries for the first time, and hand gestures in one particular country don't mean the same thing when you go to another country. So I have learned to just kind of keep my hands in my pocket. And not do
I
any
can
of
imagine. What an example that must be. Were there any actual tales that you found out that the hard way?
So far, I've been lucky, but something as simple as just holding up your index finger in some countries will get you in a lot of trouble.
Wow.
I'm taking notes here on your intro though, because the woman that you just mentioned on Twitter, that's not the first time I've seen that story. Anytime something like that happens, I always make a note of it in my special try this for marketing notebook. And like I've seen variations on this. I've seen people that have posted a pic. I gave a talk today and nobody came. I sold no books at this particular conference. Nobody stopped at my table, whatever it is. Every couple of months, it will light the world on fire. And if you're the person, it will, just completely ignite book sales, but it doesn't work for everybody. I see a lot of people try it, and it doesn't go off, but it just shows just how unpredictable, social media and people and this entire business is, because you literally have no clue. One minute you sell 2 books, the next minute you sold 100,000, and you can't explain why, and it can't be duplicated.
It's amazing, isn't it? As a little test, I just tried it before the show started because I released a book a few weeks ago, and since sales day it sold nothing. So I said sold nothing since release day. Let's see if anything happens. It's probably not going to, but yeah, we're all giving that a try. Amazing. But I don't think you have that problem, JD, because you seem to sell a lot of books. You have an incredible amount of reviews for many of your books. So I don't think sales might be a problem for you.
Well, I started, I just had my 10-year anniversary since the first book came out, Forsaken. It was November 14th of 2014. So it's been a crazy, wild ride, but I started the same place every other author does. I had 0 people on my mailing list. Nobody followed me on social media. And I got really lucky. I started capturing lightning in a bottle. That's kind of the only way to explain it. Just one after another. I had so many good things that happened in a row. I told people not to stand next to me outside because I figured lightning is going to strike, karma trying to even this out. And you didn't want to be standing next to me when it happened. I've since talked to a lot of people on the marketing side and PR firms, and they've kind of picked it apart. And essentially, like, I've taken a lot of situations that shouldn't have worked and turned them into something. So to give you an example, so my very first book, Forsaken, when I wrote the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. And just to get that last page down on paper, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there. Something you're not allowed to do. The lawyers would come knocking on your door if you tried to put that book out. And I fully expected to have to change it on the rewrite on the next draft. But my wife read it and she said, you know what? I think before you do that, you should try to get King's permission to use it. So, being as naive as I was at the time, we were in Florida at my mom's house. She actually lives about 10 minutes from King's house. We printed up the manuscript, hopped in the car, and figured we'll go over to Steve's house. He'll be outside gardening or something. I'll hand him the book. He'll give me a big thumbs up, which might mean something different in a different country. We'll be on our way, and that's it. But, it actually didn't play out that way. He lives on a little island off the coast of Florida. So you go over this tiny little bridge. If you make a left, you go to like the public portion of this bridge where the bars and the restaurants and all that kind of stuff is. And if you make a right, it's like the entire half of this island that Stephen King owns. And there's immediately a private drive sign, and there's a no trespassing sign, and there was a gate and another gate. And like, we got a half mile down this road, and I'm watching the trees for snipers, thinking this is probably not my best idea. So we turned around, we went back to a little restaurant. I called a friend of mine who knew King and told him what we were doing. And he said, "Oh yeah, don't stalk Steve. Here's his email address. Send him the book. If he likes it, he'll get back to you. If the book is shit, he probably won't reply." I'm not sure if we're allowed to swear here, so forgive me.
Yes, please do.
So, luckily King liked the book. He gave me his permission to use it. And that was kind of that. When the book came out, I indie published it. And, just like what you had mentioned, like hardly any sales straight off the bat. I got a few, little word of mouth stuff going on, but nothing crazy. So I hired a friend of mine who was a publicist. And at the time, she had been working out in LA with a lot of rock bands. And I said, "Hey, you want to try to work a book?" And we started brainstorming, and I told her about my failed trip to Stephen King's house. I never actually got there. And she's like, "You know what? That's the story." So she started pitching that story to all these publications, and then Publishers Weekly ended up writing a piece about this, new author trying to get to Stephen King's house to get, permission. And when that story came out, that's what really lit the fuse, because librarians saw that, bookstore owners saw that, they started reading about the book, talking about the book. And before I knew it, I sold about 250,000 copies. So I basically took something that could have been a non-event, that should have just kind of vanished, as a failure, and twisted it into something that worked out. And I think for longevity in this career, like, you have to be able to do that. You have to, take a look at what's working and double down on it. And then, put extra time into all these things that aren't working, and really spend time on tweaking those and turning them into something that, will take it profitable.
Yeah. It's an incredible story. I mean, you're co-working with James Patterson now. And is that something you did again? You pursued him, or was the kind of notorious, or the legend of your career already hitting him, so he approached you? How's that working out?
So my second book was called The Fourth Monkey, which is a serial killer thriller set in Chicago. I'd sold so many books on the indie side, I had no trouble getting a trad deal for the second book. And one of the things that they ask you to do is, mail out copies of your book to all these big name authors. Your editor kind of does it on your behalf, hoping to get that little quote, for the back of the book.
Yeah.
So Patterson was on that list, that mailing list of, probably 50 other big name authors. So I didn't think twice about it at the time when they sent him a copy. One day I'm sitting at my desk and I'm writing, and I get a phone call, and it's a Florida area code. And I used to live in Florida, so I figured it was somebody I knew. I pick up, and he's like, "Hey, it's Jim Patterson. You got a second?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure it is." I'm listening to this guy talk, and I'm thinking, this is one of my buddies trying to prank me. And he starts going into his review of The Fourth Monkey. And, I got about a minute into it. I'm like, this might actually really be him. And we kept talking. And then eventually we decided to meet for lunch next time I was in Florida. And, the general thinking was we want to try and write a book together. But when we met, we realized it probably wouldn't work, because I was a pantser, which I imagine you guys have probably talked about a million times. And he was a, notorious outliner. He does 30 to 60 pages for every book.
Wow.
So it seemed like it just wouldn't work. It's just two completely different styles. So we kind of walked away from that lunch, we're glad that we met each other, but that was kind of the end of it. And a couple months later, I heard back from him. He's like, "You know what? Let's try to do this your way. Let's pants the novel." So I'm the only guy that's ever gotten James Patterson to pants a novel. So I would write a chapter. I would paint him into some kind of impossible scenario, thinking there's no way Jim is going to get out of this. I'd email those pages off to him. 15 minutes later, he not only, wrote another 10, 20 pages, but he got out of it and put me in an even worse situation. And we went back and forth this whole book, just trying to one up each other. And it's the craziest, twistiest book I think I've ever written, but it was so much fun. And then when we finished it, he said, "You know what? Okay, we did it your way. I want you to try it my way. Here's an outline." So he gave me an outline for a book called The Noise, and we wrote that one. And honestly, it went so much faster, so much easier. Hardly any words on the cutting room floor when we were done. Like, we got to that last page and we were done. Just a little tweaking. And when you pants a novel, for me anyway, I would write 140, 160,000 words. That second draft, I'd go back, I'd cut 80,000 words out and kind of trim the fat and turn it into a real story. There was a lot of work on the back end. And when we outlined it, that didn't happen. So I've been outlining ever since. So the guy kind of convinced me to go that route.
Wow. That's really, really interesting. For many reasons, from the meeting to how you convinced him to start doing things differently, how he convinced you to do things differently. I mean, is there a complete change, or do you have like a mix of both styles, or are you fully plotting now?
Now I'm doing both. I'm writing additional books in my 4MK series, and that thriller series that I mentioned. I'm writing 3 prequels, and with those, I'm completely pantsing them. No idea where I was going with them. And then I'm also writing a sequel to the trilogy. And with that one, I did an outline. So I'm kind of using, both methods. And I've learned, in working with Jim, like he has taught me so much. But one of the things that I got from him is just to try to keep it fresh all the time. You just keep changing it up. So I'm always trying new methods. You can't really see it, but there's a typewriter behind me on a table. I'm writing a book on there. So every day I write like another paragraph on that typewriter. I've got another one that I'm writing in longhand. And I find that every time I change up the medium, my voice changes and the story changes, and it just allows me to, create new fresh content in different ways. So anytime I hear somebody, come up with some crazy, like this is how I'm writing a book, and if I haven't tried it, I'll try it.
Nice. I like that. Brilliant. Okay, what we're going to do is, otherwise we're going to talk for a million hours on these amazing little stories, but we want to get some sort of structure in here. So we're going to play the part 1 video because we want to learn a little bit about how you got into the world of writing. We've already learned about kind of how you started your self-publishing journey into your traditional publishing. So let's go back to find out the initial inspirations in the road to writing. So coming up, the road to writing. So JD, going way back to where you can remember, where did you start thinking that you wanted to become a writer, and how did that start? Where was it that you took the first step?
I think like with many of us, I've been writing pretty much my entire life. I grew up without a TV in the house, so we were hitting the library at a very early age. I'd been reading by the time I was 3, and I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me. So I would write stories and I would staple the pages together. I created a little library in my room, and she'd come and check out the stories, and I would charge her late fees. She still owes me money like to this day, but so this started way back. But it's always been a hobby, and it was a hobby mainly because my parents, the people in my life, told me you can't make a living as a writer. You have to get a real job. So it was always this thing I did on the side for fun. So, I graduated high school, I went off to college, and, I ended up with degrees in business, another one in finance. I got halfway through a psychology degree, ended up in the corporate world working in finance. But I would come home and I would write at night. And during that whole time, I was working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. Way back when I was in college, I had worked for a bunch of newspapers and magazines. And when you work in that world, you quickly realize everybody's got a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere. It's 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for 8 years. It's almost done. It just needs a little something. And I kind of became their go-to guy to look at those and kind of help them develop the story. And it started off with just grammar and punctuation, and then just turned into developmental edits. And over time, that turned into a side hustle as a ghostwriter and a book doctor. So while I was in the corporate world, I would come home and I would work on those projects. And I did that for a little over 20 some years. I think it was 23 altogether. 6 of those books that I had written as a ghostwriter ended up hitting the New York Times list, but all with other people's names on the cover, which gets old after a while. And when that 6th one hit, my wife pulled me aside. She's like, I know you want to be a full-time writer. Let's figure out a way to make this happen. But we were kind of stuck at that point because I'd been working in finance. I had a big salary and we had the lifestyle behind that. So we had a nice house, we had cars, we had a boat. Our monthly nut was extremely expensive. We couldn't just walk away from that lifestyle. So she came up with this crazy plan. She said, we're going to sell everything that we own. Which we did. We literally down to the stuff we could fit in a car. We bought a duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and lived in the other side. We basically downsized from 4,500 square feet to about 800 square feet. And it got to the point like we basically got our expenses down to nothing. And she showed me the bank statement one day, and she said, "Okay, based on savings, you've got about 18 months to make it as a writer. Go." And nothing like putting your feet to the fire. And like I wouldn't have pulled that trigger on my own. It took somebody supportive behind me to do that. Like you need a spouse to think that's on board with a plan like that. And I got lucky. I mean, Forsaken did really well, and the books that followed did really well. But if she hadn't pushed me, I'd probably still be working that desk job and hating it.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible story. And what's amazing is how most people in the world, if they have a dream, whether it's writing or something else, as soon as they get into that corporate world or their version of that, that tends to be the direction they go, and the creativeness or whatever that dream might be gets forgotten. And you kept yourself in that dream, and that's what led on to you getting to where you were, which I think is really important. But what's interesting is when you spoke about being the book doctor, and you were fixing all these books and getting them onto the New York Times bestsellers. So why do you think people were turning to you? What do you know what made you different to them to be able to get that magic put in the book?
Yes, I do now, but I didn't know it at the time. I'm autistic, and I was diagnosed at 22. One of the things that autistic people, or people like me, I was diagnosed with something called Asperger's syndrome. We mimic social situations. We mimic other people. So, if I'm in a group of people and somebody cracks a joke, I'll start laughing, not because I find it funny, but because the four people around me think it's funny. So I basically mimic my way through a lot of these types of situations. But what I learned as an author is I can do that on paper too. So if you hand me a couple pages written by somebody, I can read that and I could pick up and continue in that author's voice. I pick up on their cadence, their vocabulary, their writing style, and I can keep writing as them to the point where it's indistinguishable, which is a fantastic skill to have when you're working as a ghostwriter. I wrote memoirs for politicians, for sports figures. I could have a couple conversations with that person, and then I could jump down and on paper, I could be them. So that worked out really well. The education that I got during that process, though, that was priceless, because, if you're a traditionally published author, let's say you've got something wrong with your book, and it doesn't really matter what it is, but like your editor will call you, they're going to tell you 2 or 3 things that are fantastic about the book. Then they're going to tell you that one little thing they actually need you to fix. And then they're going to tell you 2 or 3 more things that are great about the book, and kind of sandwich your problem between a bunch of accolades to make you feel good. And then they hang up the phone. In my world, I was a hired gun. So if they had a manuscript that needed work, they would bring in somebody like me, and they wouldn't hold back. They would tell me, listen, this person can't write dialogue to save their life. They're wordy, they're too this, too that. But they basically told me, without any sugarcoating, what the folks in New York really wanted in a best-selling book. And 2 decades of that getting drilled into my head, when it came time for me to actually sit down and write my own, I was pulling from that knowledge base. So even though I started writing later in life, I was 43 when I published that first book, I really credit those 20 some years as teaching me how to write. I could have put a novel out in my 20s, but I may not be sitting here today if I had done that. I think I needed that education behind me. I needed those 2 decades. So I was 2 decades in the making, I guess, is the short version.
JD, do you remember when the transition from you mimicking and using those other voices in your work, when the transition came from that's them, and then, oh, this is me now, I'm finding my own voice? And what was that like?
It's an odd thing. And I still go through that today, because, like working with somebody like Patterson, to an extent, I've got to mimic his voice. It's changed a little bit because my name's on the cover now, so I get some leeway to sound like myself. But I've still taken on ghostwriting projects over the last couple of years, and where I have to jump back into that. And then I find that when I get back to my own project, it takes a day or two to find my own voice again. I think for authors in general, you have to write, if I had to guess, about 500,000 words before you really find your own voice. Because typically what ends up happening, if let's say you're a big Stephen King fan and you want to become a writer, you're going to sit down, you're going to try to write, you're going to try and sound like Stephen King. You're going to fail miserably because you're not King, but you're going to try to sound like him. And you're going to keep sounding like him. And then sooner or later, if you put enough words on paper, your own voice starts to creep out. You learn to trust your own voice. So you're not trying to copy what somebody else had done. You're basically willing to trust your own subconscious and allow that voice to come out on paper. And it clicks at some point, I think, for every author. I can switch it on and off. So, I still do this. I do it. It's almost like a party trick with other authors. They'll put a book in front of me, and I'll write the next paragraph of that book as them. Just to throw them off. And it's fun. But I think in a lot of ways that it drives my own writing too, because, I really do become my characters, when I write, like the different voices, the different people, they're completely different individual people to me. And I'm able to bring that out on paper. And I think a lot of that is all stemming from the same thing.
That's incredible.
I was going to say, like, probing you on that, can you describe what's going on in your mind? I know it sounds like it might be quite a difficult question, but if you picked up a piece of work from somebody and they said, I want you to write the next chapter as this person, what would the process be like in your mind in terms of deciphering what it is that makes their writing unique to them?
I think it's very similar to an actor. If you've ever watched an actor basically become a character, to me, it's the same thing. I become that person. So like when I wrote the prequel to Dracula, I had access to all of Bram Stoker's notes. I literally had the stuff he had on his desk sitting in front of me on my own desk. I had journals that he had. I had a diary written by his sister. I had all this material in front of me. So I was able mentally to become Bram Stoker to the point where I could put words on paper and like I can't tell the difference between what I wrote versus what he wrote. And the funny thing is, like when that book went off to the editor, they hired another editor to come in to do the copy edits on it. This person had a doctorate in Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. And went through the book and like they thought that was going to work. And what they didn't realize is Frankenstein came out about 80 years before Dracula did. Like the written language had changed considerably. Like in Mary Shelley's time, they didn't use contractions. And there were a lot of differences. But like they went through the book and they made all these changes. And I was like, Bram would never use the word betwixt. Like Bram would not say this. Bram would not say that. And I could prove it, like I could give them a sentence and I could say, go look at this particular thing written by Bram. Here's how he would phrase that. You've got it wrong. So it's just, I've over time, I've learned to just sort of do that. A lot of it is just being autistic though. I know it's a skill set that I've got as an autistic person. I've doubled down on it and just kind of learned to tweak it and use it.
What's really interesting about that is that you can really kind of dissect the information provided to you in terms of the written work. Do you see anything in the modern day that you've worked on that has any sort of similarity to kind of say Bram Stoker's work in terms of quality?
No, unfortunately, no. Like when you go back, like even when I had Bram's sister's diary, like she was, I think 7 or 8 years old when she wrote this. It was written on par with an adult writing today,
Wow.
and better than most adults. It's sad, but I think the written language has died in a lot of ways. I mean, we've got so many other things to keep us entertained. People are writing less and less. I mean, one of my favorite things to do, and this may sound a little morbid, but I used to read letters from like Civil War soldiers back to their wives and girlfriends, because it was just, they were written so well, and the emotion that they were able to put down on paper, like they could articulate it perfectly. And you ask somebody to do that in today's world, and like they can't even slam out a text. Without a misspelling or a punctuation problem.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I've got so many questions going around because we've never had an author with your capabilities on the show before, and the name drops that you dropped at the start. I was like, what? And obviously working on Bram Stoker's stuff as well. What was that like for you in terms of? Obviously, you've talked about your ability to be able to do that, but still, I think a lot of people would be intimidated by the history and the sort of weight behind the name. So what was that process like for you?
There were two things that really sold me on it. I mean, Dracula was what I consider the first adult book that I ever read. I read a lot of like Dickens and stuff like that when I was growing up, and my mom owned an antique shop, so we used to go to a lot of yard sales, and we were at one on a Saturday, and somebody had a box of books, and a copy of Dracula was sitting up on top for 25 cents, and I picked it up and looked at the cover. I was like, there's no way my mom's going to let me buy this. And she let me buy it and read it. And it's one of those books that I've gone back to over the years. Probably every 5 years or so, I read it again. And it kind of takes on different meaning as you get older, and you pick up on different nuances about it. But when Dacre Stoker first approached me about this project, he's Bram's great-grandnephew. His family had read Forsaken, my first novel, and he told me that the family had been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a while, and they were hopeful that I would be willing to pick it up. And partly because of what I was able to do, the whole mimicking thing, being able to write like other people, but also because they liked my writing style. But two things that he told me actually sold me on the project. The first was that Bram Stoker fully believed vampires were real, to the point where he actually had himself cremated when he died at a time in history when people didn't do that. He was worried about a vampire coming for his immortal soul. And he actually tried to sell Dracula as a true story. The second thing that Dacre had told me is that where Dracula starts, Jonathan Harker on the Train, is actually page 120 of the original manuscript. His publisher stripped out the first 120 pages of the book because Bram basically used those 120 pages to tell the world vampires were real. So he gave that manuscript to his editor. His editor pushed it back across the desk and said, "No way we're going to do this. It's too scary. People are going to buy into it." And at the time, Jack the Ripper was active in London. Supernatural was common. People believed in that, so they weren't willing to do it. So like knowing those two things, and then knowing I was going to be able to recreate basically those 120 pages, like that completely sold me on it. And then it became a detective project. We had to try and piece this story together. Bram was very good at leaving clues. So in today's world, if I write a book, I write it in English, I send it off to my editor, they clean it up, and then they farm it out to all the other countries. It gets translated into different languages, and that's kind of how it gets through the world. In Bram's time, it didn't work that way. He had to actually mail a copy of the book off to every other country. So for Germany, he sent it off to the German publisher. For French, he sent it off to the French publisher. So things that he wasn't allowed to keep in the book in English, he snuck them back in these other editions. But the cool part about this is Dracula is such a popular book. It's the number 2 best-selling novel in the world, or book in the world, next to the Bible. But because it's public domain, they all tend to use that same text when they do these translations. So every copy you pick up at the store, it's done off this free text that you can get pretty much anywhere. So what Dacre Stoker and his family, what they realized is they get original first editions of Dracula and translate them back to English. They started finding all these breadcrumbs that Bram left behind. So we started using those, putting those together, and we basically wrote the book, figured out, the first 120 pages, wrote the novel. But before we were willing to publish it, we wanted to verify it. So I did some research and realized that there was only one copy of the original manuscript ever found in existence. It was found in a barn in Pennsylvania here in the States, and nobody knows exactly how it got there. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, actually bought it at auction. So I reached out to Paul Allen's people and asked, is there any way we could get in there and see this? I was hoping those 120 pages would be there. He agreed to let us out there. So we flew out to Seattle. They locked us in a conference room, took away our phones, made us wear gloves, and just started wheeling in this manuscript with a bunch of people standing around us, just making sure we weren't going to, burn it or eat it or try to walk off with it. First thing Dacre and I did is we flipped over to that first page, and right up at the top, 120 is crossed out and number 1 is put next to it. Dracula is written at the top, all in Bram's handwriting. So the pages weren't there either. But what we quickly learned is, like in today's world, if you delete something, you're doing it on your computer. You swipe back and it's gone forever. In Bram's time, you couldn't delete. He drew a line through it. So we started going through the manuscript, looking at all the deleted text, stuff that he crossed out, and realized that referenced the first 120 pages. So we were able to use that to verify our content. But like the entire project was just unbelievable from start to finish. I had so much fun working on that.
Yeah, I can imagine. What a story that is. Instantly, when you said it was found in the barn as well, and no one knows how it got there, it just adds more mystery to the whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, Dacre believes that it was traded for a Walt Whitman manuscript, but nobody knows for sure. And then somebody had bought the farm, and they were cleaning out that barn, and they found it. It's amazing what you find in a box. When you go through stuff, you never know what could be there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things when you look at horror is one of and Chris mentioned this, actually shared we're doing an Advent video series at the moment. We release a clip from the show every day through December, and today's clip was with Neil McRobert from Talking Scared podcast. And Chris actually said one of the scariest things that he finds is all the commonalities in the world. So he actually spat your drink out when I said about your foot hanging out the end of the duvet and things in the cupboard. But I think finding stuff in an attic, for example, is often well used in horrors when people move into a new house. It's one of those things. And I think something just being left in a barn and someone picking it up, it makes that book almost more than a book. It makes it almost like it has a power or something about it extra. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've got a copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and it's actually signed by Arthur Conan Doyle. And my mom found that at a yard sale. But the coolest part about it is in the back of the book, everybody that read it wrote their name and they dated it.
Wow.
So there's just pages of signatures dating back almost 100 years. And it makes you think, like this tiny little book, like how it's probably traveled the world and gone to all these different places and had this crazy life all on its own, and now it's sitting on the shelf behind me. So who knows where it's going to go next? I mean,
yeah,
anything like that, it always fascinates me. I mean, you can kind of see off to the side there's a stack of pages next to my fireplace. Those are actually the original pages of Needful Things from Stephen King's typewriter. And I got those through a friend of ours, a guy named David Morrell, who invented Rambo. He used to be a beta reader for King back in the day. He actually found that in his basement. Like he used to, King's manuscripts, used to go through and, help him clean up the typos. And he found literally all the, big names from the 80s, all those iconic books just lying around his basement. So I scooped that one up. And honestly, like I like to look through it just because it's fun to see what somebody like Stephen King changes, on a manuscript. Where are his mistakes? What does he take out? It's inspiring to me.
It really is amazing.
JD, if you're obviously working with some of these huge authors and reading their work and deciphering everything about what they do, what is the most surprising thing that you've found about the craft in itself and how it is unique to each person?
Well, with somebody like King, like I read everything that he writes pretty much first as a fan, and then I'll go back through with a highlighter and I look at it as an author. Because he can create a character in like 2 sentences, and that is not an easy thing to do. So I try to dissect that and figure out how to do it. Writing with somebody like James Patterson, like that has been a priceless education. I don't know if you've ever taken his masterclass online. Working with him is very much like taking that class, except for he calls you and tells you everything you're doing wrong. So there's that, but like he is extremely hands-on with his co-authors, and like he has just taught me a ton. Like little things, like you don't really think about it, but like when you write a chapter, you get to the end and like our brain wants closure. Like we want, because it's the end of a chapter. So we try to write an ending for that chapter. But one of the things that he taught me to do straight off the bat is when we go back through the manuscript, most of the time we take off either the last paragraph, the last sentence. We chop off something at the very end of every chapter, and it basically creates this cliffhanger. That wasn't there intrinsically as you were writing it. It's such a simple thing. I mean, it takes maybe 20-30 minutes to go through an entire book and do that, but it turns it into one of those those page turners. You get to the end of that chapter and you can't help but go on to the next one and the next one and the next one. One of the other things he taught me is he said, I can't talk today. He uses the phrase, be there a lot. So like at the top of like when he's writing on a notepad, he'll write the phrase "be there," meaning that he wants to be right there in the moment with his characters. And he used to drill that home with me. I would send him pages and he would read them and he's like, "I'm not with those characters. I'm not close enough. Drill down deeper, drill down deeper." And you just find yourself getting closer and closer to the situation where you literally put the reader right in the mix with the characters. They almost feel like these events are unfolding around them instead of, a typical book where you're more of a voyeur.
Yeah. Would you be able to give a tip then on how an author could do that, as in immerse the reader more into the character?
It's a tricky thing. I mean, I do a lot with dialogue. A lot of authors tend to just, they like to explain everything. When I was working as a book doctor, I used to cut, probably 90% of the time I would take the first chapter out of a book, and the book, I would start the book at chapter 2. Because authors always feel like this need to set the scene, create this, develop that. And like a lot of times it's so much better to start, right in the middle of action and then take whatever you needed to communicate, those essential parts, and just kind of sprinkle them throughout the book. I likened it a lot to the Indiana Jones movies. If you think of, Raiders of the Lost Ark, it starts with that crazy opening scene. And they could have just as easily started with him, as the professor, in the university, and skip that scene altogether. But think of how boring that movie would have probably felt. But instead, they start with this crazy opening. You get all amped up, all this adrenaline is flowing, and then that scene ends, and you relax a little bit, and you're along for the ride. You're willing to participate as they tell you what the story is supposed to be about. It's a very simple trick. There's a movie called Swordfish with John Travolta where they do it extremely well. They basically start the movie at probably the 3/4 point of the actual story. They kind of throw you in the middle of the craziest action scene in the film at the very beginning, and then they flash back 48 hours earlier or whatever it is they do. You can do that in a book just as easily as you can on film. Doesn't always happen on that first draft. A lot of times you have to write the first draft. You may write it in a linear fashion, but then you can take all those pieces and kind of shuffle the deck.
Yeah, I love that. And I've really noticed recently on a lot of TV series I'm watching that you almost get that a whole 10 minutes of action or interesting scene before the credits actually start in new TV series now. And I think that's for the exact same reason.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and I think in general, attention spans are getting a lot smaller. Like I used to read a full book even if I didn't like it, and then that kind of changed. And I was like, I'll read the first 50 pages of a book, if I don't like it. Now I get like page, 2 pages in, like I know whether or not I'm going to finish that book, and I have no problem putting it down. And I think people are the same way when it comes to TV.
Yeah.
When we finally got a TV in my house, we had 3 channels. There was barely anything to watch to begin with. But in today's world, you can watch literally anything you want, whenever you want. We're spoiled by that. Like if I watch, like it's very difficult for me to sit down and just watch a movie, without picking up my phone or without something else going on. I think the only thing I can just sit down and watch is the news channels, and only because, they've got a talking head over here. They've got text happening over here on the right. There's a scroll happening down at the bottom. There's a lot of stuff to keep my brain active. And I think, our brains have been rewired to, expect that and want that. And it's difficult not to have it. And I think when you're writing fiction, particularly when you're writing thrillers, you have to get that down on paper. You have to grab them from that first sentence and create a situation where they can't let go.
Absolutely. Right. What we're going to do is we're going to go on to part 2 of the show, which is What's the Story? And we're going to talk about We Don't Talk About Emma. So hopefully when we come back from that, and I can see actually you've got a few stacked up behind you there as well. You could give us a little rundown of what that book's about for the audience, and then we can ask some questions about that. So part 2 coming right up. So JD, We Don't Talk About Emma. What's the story?
So we're going to talk about Emma.
Oh, well, without spoilers.
Yeah. So the thing is, like, working with somebody like James Patterson, one of the other things that he taught me is just how much I enjoyed working with other people, working with co-authors. I can write a police procedural all on my own, but it is way more fun to write that book with an actual cop. Because that cop can bring a lot to the table that, I can fake my way through. I can do some Google searches, I can do some research, and I can kind of, get it down on paper and make it believable. But having an authentic voice behind me completely changes the game. So I've been doing a lot of co-authored projects lately, just looking for experts in various things that can add something to the mix that I wouldn't be able to do on my own. So in this particular case, I worked with a guy named E.J. Findorff, who just knows New Orleans, the city, inside and out. He knows the people, he knows the places, he knows the cops. So he was, because New Orleans is one of those places that it's almost a character by itself in a story. Like it's got a vibe, it's got a personality, it's got a smell. If you ever go there in the fun, it's got a bad smell at night, and it's a totally clean smell in the morning. Somehow they hose that whole place down. But like he was able to communicate all that on paper. So, that's one of the things I love about co-authoring. Like we can just create this story that I wouldn't be able to create on my own. In this one, we start off, we've got a girl that's been raped. There's a serial rapist. The cops know who he is, but he keeps getting away with it over and over and over again. This last girl that he raped, her name is Emma. They tried to prosecute. He got away with the crime again. And the lead detective is basically fed up. She's had enough of it. So we open the book with her sneaking to this guy's house. It's the middle of the night. She's got a gun. She's ready to execute him. She watches his garage doors is open. She sees him in the car, like in the garage. She sneaks up on him, gets ready to put a bullet in his head, and realizes somebody beat her to it. He's been stabbed to death. He's sitting in the car, and she immediately realizes, Emma is the most likely suspect because she's the only other person floating around out there who's got a reason to do it. But she's in the wind. So the police detective basically spends the book trying to find Emma, as Emma takes, the situation kind of in her own hands, and the people around her and the people of the city actually protect her as she's doing it, because, she's doing something that they all want to see happen. So it's a fun, fast-paced, crazy story.
Yeah. I mean, it's the story of justice and vengeance. It's how do you kind of balance between the two? And as you mentioned, a fun, fast-paced story. So how do you keep those main themes throughout the story and keep it fast-paced as well?
Well, one of the things I learned early on is, characters are never black and white. Your cops are never, the perfectly, good people, and bad guys aren't necessarily 100% bad. Everybody exists somewhere in that gray area, somewhere in the middle. And when you're writing a book, when you're telling a story, like those are the parts that I tend to focus on. So you can take like the most heinous person in the world, but if you show a couple reasons why other people like them, you can make them a little gray. When I wrote The Fourth Monkey, I mean, it ends with the serial killer. I think a lot of people actually feel bad for the killer, more so than some of the victims. because of the reasoning behind it. And, as an author, like that's, that was the goal, that it's a win when you can pull it off, when you get people thinking about it.
Yeah, I love that. Chris, do you have any questions about the book? I mean, first of all, the cover as well, that looks great, but I'm really intrigued on how many reviews all your other books have. But just before you jump in there, Chris, I want to say, do you expect that this book will have a similar sort of feedback and following that the rest of your books seem to have had?
It's tough to say, because even when I write a book with somebody like James Patterson, I get a ton of reviews where people are like, "You should just write books on your own." And I get that, but I enjoy working with these other people, and even working with somebody like EJ, working with somebody like Jim, some of my other books, I could write those stories on my own, but I think they're better, if I work with somebody else. So I like to think it's going to be as well received. It's hard to say, until it hits the market. But I had fun writing it, and to me that's a telltale sign. Like if I enjoy writing the book, chances are readers are gonna enjoy reading it. There's plenty of books that I've put down, at the midway point. I'm like, I'm not having fun writing this. I'm not going to finish it.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So I suppose I've got two questions. Why this book now, or obviously when you wrote it? And the second part to that question, I've just lost in my mind. But why this book? Why this book now? Was the first part.
Why this book now? Scheduling. I've got so many books coming out at this point. I've got some that I wrote years ago that are coming out next year. Like it's kind of all over the place, and like I've got books coming out with so many different people that I have to factor all these different things. Like I don't want to publish a book on my own the same month that a book that I've written with James Patterson is coming out.
Yeah.
When you get into the marketing side of it, what ends up happening is I'll try to buy a Facebook ad, and his publishing company is out there bidding $3 for that same ad for my own name. So like I can't compete with that. So I try to stagger them, but I've created kind of a new business model. I've got 2 to 3 co-author or solo titles coming out, and I'm putting out a ton of co-author titles in between those. I recently signed a new deal with Simon & Schuster. They're handling all my print sales and distribution for my own imprint. So I kind of have the best of both worlds. I'm sort of operating as an indie, but playing in the traditional model. So with a book like this one, we slotted for February. March, I've got one coming out with Patterson. April is kind of a quiet month because my next solo release comes out in May, and I wanted 2 months to be able to promote that one, so we left April open. Got another co-author title coming out in June. My ultimate goal is to have one book coming out every month,
which is incredible.
Yeah, take us into a day in your life in terms of your writing. And like a lot of obviously people watch this show because they're interested in how a writer does it, in terms of like what it actually looks like in terms of numbers, time, all that type of stuff. So could you break that down for us?
Yeah. So when I wrote The Fourth Monkey, I was still kind of working on the day job. I was trying to get out of that, but I was doing about 60 to 80 hours a week, at the day job. So I would cram writing in whenever I could, 200 words here, 300 words there. If I was standing in line at the grocery store, I'd have my phone out and I'd type on there. I learned a lot of little tricks when I was doing that. I listened to a thunderstorm soundtrack whenever I write. So basically white noise on noise canceling headphones. It's a Pavlov's dog thing. As soon as I hear that sound, my brain immediately knows it's time to write, so I snap into writer mode. One of the other things that I learned is, a lot of my writer friends, like they would sit down and have these marathon writing sessions. They would crank out 5, 6, 7, 10,000 words at a time. They start at 8 o'clock in the morning, they finish up at 11 o'clock at night, and they're spent, they're completely burnt out by the end of that. And the next day they would sit down and try to continue, and they stare at a blank screen because they've got nothing left in them. So I've kind of learned what my limitations are. I quit writing pretty much every day. I knock out 2,000 to 3,000 words, and that's kind of it. Then I switch on the business side of this and deal with all of that. But when I'm writing, I always stop somewhere in like a midpoint. Like I always know what's basically coming next. So I'll stop halfway through a sentence, halfway through a paragraph, but I never actually complete the thought. And what I find is that as I go about the rest of my day, my brain continues working that story. And then the next day when I sit down, I'm basically just finishing a sentence that I already started, so it's so easy to get right back into that flow. So I've been doing that for years. One of the things that Dean Koontz taught me is he rereads whatever he wrote the previous day at the start of his writing day. So when I sit down first thing in the morning, I read whatever I wrote yesterday. I go through it, clean it up, I edit it. And by the time I get to the end of that, again, it puts me back in the frame of mind. I just continue the story. And I think those are the types of things, to do this as a full-time gig, you have to have that kind of mindset. Like you have to, pace yourself. You have to know what your limitations are. Like I can do a 6,000 word day, but I know the next day I'm going to take 3,000 of those words and throw them in the trash, so like I know that my quitting point is around 3,000. So I've learned to accept that. But usually I get the words done on whatever my current book is, on my own solo title by around 10:30 and 11. I keep the internet turned off until that point because there's just too much going on out there. So when I get the words done, I flip on the internet, all these emails come in with the business side of stuff that I have to deal with, and the agents and contracts and interviews and all these other fun things that take up a lot of time. And then I have a quitting bell that rings at 3:00, no matter what. One of the things that really snuck up on me when I first started selling books in a lot of different places is I would get interview requests at crazy times, like 11 o'clock at night, 2:00 in the morning, because they're trying to fit whatever time, they're in whatever country they're in. And I took all of those and I was exhausted. I was hardly getting any sleep. And I was like, there's no way I can keep this up. So in today's world, my quitting bell rings at 3:00. I usually don't accept anything after 3 p.m. I leave my office, I go for a run around the island where I live and kind of spend an hour and a half just doing that and clear my head. And the rest of the night is just devoted to wife and family, to try and relax and enjoy some of this, because it's so easy to, sit behind that desk and keep going and going and going. But, there's more to life than that.
Yeah. I think what you've done there is work out a system to make it a marathon, not a race. And I think that's really kind of important, especially setting time aside for your family and your enjoyment, like going for a run and clearing your mental health and actually making room for that creativity. I think is really important. And we know there's a lot of people that just work and work and work, and then basically, as you mentioned, run out of that steam. So I think what you've done there is build yourself a career platform for longevity. So I think that's great advice and great tips people should definitely pick up on. Yeah, fantastic.
Being wary of the time, Chris, I think we should go to community questions, because if they're anything like me right now, they'll have an awful lot of questions and we've got 9 minutes left.
Yeah, we shall do. Part 3, guys, community questions. If you have questions for our guest, JD Barker, and I'm sure you do, as Chris mentioned, please send them in now. We will ask our staple questions and you get your chance to ask some as well. So coming up, part 3 of the show, staple questions, community question time. Chris Hooley, you can take it away. I know you're bursting to ask some questions, so go for it.
I feel like I want to ask a slightly different question, but we've not prepared, so maybe I won't do that. But I would obviously one of our staple questions is if you could take any character from fiction and make that character your own, which character would you choose and why?
Oh wow, that's actually really, really tough. I've read so much, and I read outside of genre all the time. Like if it's a good story, I'm in. I don't care if it's romance or sci-fi or Western or whatever. I think if I could do anything, it would probably be complete like a Thomas Harris novel. It drives me nuts knowing that Hannibal Lecter is still running around out there, and I kind of want to finish up that storyline. I'd love to write a Sherlock Holmes novel too. Which is public domain, so I probably could. But there's only 27 hours in the day, so I can only do so much.
I would love for you to do both of those. I think Thomas Harris, like I know he does still write, and he wrote obviously a book, released one relatively recently. But yeah, I'd love him to pass the book over to you. That'd be great.
Okay, good answer. I'd love to find out what you do with Hannibal, but we're moving it on. Go on, Chris. What are you going to say?
No, I feel like I may have made myself up. Is he still alive?
Yeah. He's in his 80s. He lives on South Beach, and I have tried every possible way to get him to give up that storyline and let somebody else take it over. And he is not willing to do it as of yet. Like I am notorious. I am like a little, one of those little yappy dogs that just doesn't give up.
Yeah, I love that.
Sooner or later, you're going to
just
see a
keep
press
going.
release. Thomas Harris got a restraining order against J.D. Barker, or it's going to say J.D. Barker continues the Hannibal Lecter storyline. One of those two things.
Yeah. Well, when you say go for a run, do you like kind of keep nagging him now? You're running past his house, and throwing things across the fence. Okay, if you could change the ending to anything, whether it be a TV show, a film, or a book, what ending would you change and why?
Whew, these are tough. Wow. I guess it probably comes back to the Thomas Harris thing. Like I don't like where they left that. And they changed it from the book, which bugged me a little bit too.
Yeah.
I always try to respect, when other people do that sort of thing. Like I've got books that are being adapted right now for film and TV, and like they are taking them in completely different directions than I did with the book. And I had a conversation years back with, I think it might have been Stephen King. It was one of those bigger name authors. But they had told me that, like the only thing that's yours as an author is the written word, the actual printed text. Like the second you hand that off to an audiobook narrator, now all of a sudden it's that narrator's take on your book. So it's already different. And when Hollywood buys it, like they just kind of get free license to kind of go, and do their own thing. And, I like the fact that other people have a different vision. And even if they come up with a different storyline, with my characters, it's kind of fun to watch, to see those things take on a life of their own.
Yeah. It was one of the interesting conversations I had with Max Brooks about his World War Z, because the film basically had no sort of similarity, very few similarities to the book.
Right.
It was kind of interesting, but that does definitely happen. Were you kind of frustrated by that process, or are you happy, as you said, to just let them be creative, or was there still like, this is my baby, I kind of want it to be as I've written it?
The only time I've actually nixed something is we had, I don't want to say what studio was working on, but one of the studios was working on the Fourth Monkey series, and they sent me their initial thoughts for a screenplay, and they had my serial killer locking his victims in a basement in an acrylic plastic cage. And if you've ever seen the show You on Netflix, that's essentially where Joe, the serial killer in that series, where he puts his victims. So like it was so similar. That was the only time I raised my hand and said, like, we can't do something that's already been done. We've got to change it up. But otherwise, I honestly, I take a step back from all the Hollywood stuff because it is this crazy roller coaster. I can give you a quick example. I know we're short on time, but A Caller's Game, when I wrote that, Ridley Scott's company picked it up almost immediately. And a couple months in, we got a phone call saying Jennifer Garner wants to be involved. As soon as Jennifer Garner came on, she had what's called a first look deal with Netflix. So then Netflix was basically on board. Netflix greenlit a $100 million budget. So like all this stuff came together probably in the course of about 2 weeks. And then about a week later, we got another phone call. Jennifer Garner has to pull out because of a scheduling conflict. So now Jennifer Garner is gone, Netflix is gone, and the budget is gone. So like imagine getting those phone calls. Now, like that's happened to me over and over and over again. Like literally all of my books are optioned with the exception of one. And nothing has actually been filmed yet over the course of 10 years. So like that story, like you could repeat it over and over again in different variations for different books. So for me, it's easier just to keep my head down and write the next book, just knowing that sooner or later something's going to get to film.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. We definitely hope so.
I'm gonna switch to, well, I'll ask it quickly because obviously it's a morbid question, but obviously it fits with various different things that you do. So you're on your deathbed, you're looking back at your writing career. What would you be happy with? What is success to you?
Every book I get out there is a little success. It's a little win. I would probably lean over and tell my daughter, you're going to find books on my computer. Do not publish those. Like there's a reason Daddy didn't put those out. But other than that, like, I don't think I would change anything. I mean, even going back to like my very first book, Forsaken, like if I read it today, there's stuff in there that I would, completely change. I would edit, I would clean up, I'm a much better writer than I was back then. But at the same time, that's where I was, at that particular place. So it feels like it needs to stand as is. So I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah. Nice. Brilliant. Okay. Anya says, thank you for your question, Anya. Favorite supernatural entity? Vampire. Go on, Chris, pronounce that for me. I always get it wrong. Chupacabra.
Chupacabra.
That one. Yeah. A ghost, an alien, or the Loch Ness monster, etc. I can't speak either.
It's hard to argue with vampires, but one of the things, like Anne Rice kind of glamorized them. They became these romantic characters. In Bram's world, when I went through his journals, he had pages and pages of notes on vampires, and he found vampire legends in virtually every culture where he looked, which is very telling because a lot of these legends existed before, people really started traveling the world. And then they started comparing notes. So, like, there were vampires everywhere. And then all of a sudden people started traveling and realized, hey, you got one of those too. Which makes me think, that all of these stories are probably based on reality at some level, whether it's aliens, vampires, Chupacabra, or whatever. There's some type of truth at the root of every single one of these. And I think sooner or later we're going to get to it. I think the one that I personally like the most is ghosts. There's something about that. Living in New England, like you can kind of feel it. Like I've literally got a cemetery in my backyard. Like it feels like you can feel that atmosphere everywhere around here. And I would love to see some type of actual real proof. And I wouldn't be surprised if one day if we actually see it.
Wow. I love that. You don't have a Tesla by any chance, do you?
I do not. I've got a deposit on the new Roadster that's been sitting out there forever, but they haven't sent me one yet.
Have you seen the videos going around online where, the sensors that show when something's close to a car? I think certain cars, the Tesla ones, can show figures of people when they're close to the car. And there's people driving through graveyards that show people near the car, and there's no one near the car.
That is insanely creepy, and I've never heard of that, but I know where I'm going next on YouTube. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Halo says, what is the most shocking thing you found in an antique store or an old book?
I find a lot of things that, in the writer world, what if are probably my two favorite words. So I can't get to it right now, but there's an old pocket watch on the shelf up there behind me that I found in an antique store. And it's really cool looking. It's super old. And like the face is glass, so you can see all the mechanics behind it. And when I picked it up, I started thinking about what if, and my brain went to, what if I were to wind this? And then once I wound it, it was bound to me. And if it ever stopped ticking, I would stop ticking. Ooh. So basically whoever winds that watch, like they have to keep it wound forever, or they have to hand it off to somebody else who's, takes that burden on. And that became the basis for a story. So, antique stores are just fantastic when it comes to things like that. There's so much, history and lore, I could spend the day in one and come up with like what if scenarios.
Yeah, that's amazing.
JD, this has been absolutely brilliant having you on the show. I'd love if at some point, if you've got another book out for you to come on again, I'll make a slot because I'd love a part two. It's been brilliant chatting to you.
Yeah, I had a ball. I'll come back anytime. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Chris, you said if he's got a book out, I think there's 6 in the next 6 months, which is again a whole new conversation about how you actually managed to keep that up there. It's incredible. But yeah, finally, before we do wrap this up, where can people find out more about you, JD, and buy your books, obviously, and where can they get all that information?
The easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. On social media, I'm at JD Barker on the various platforms. Books are pretty much in every bookstore.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, as Chris said, it's been wonderful. There's so much more we could talk to you about. And what we think you've done previously and what we think you're doing is absolutely incredible. Please do keep stalking people in that sense. It's amazing to hear those stories. I don't think I've ever heard, we've done over, God knows, 300 shows now. We've never heard a story like that where they've gone chasing authors for their sort of...
This has been my favorite show, hands down.
Oh, I appreciate it, guys.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy your runs and your graveyard in your garden. But thank you so much for us.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.